previous lectures, we've got a picture of African farming systems being relatively low on the productivity side, and that therefore propagating through into food insecurity concerns. But it's also important to think of it from a climate change adaptation perspective. If we are able to increase the productivity of systems today, that in theory will make them much more resilient to the climate changes that we might be expecting, at least in the near future. African agricultural yields are really low compared to the rest of the world. And one way to look at this is by quantifying what we call a yield gap. Now, the yield gap is the difference between the yields that one gets from a farm compared to the potential yield if that crop was grown sort of under optimum farming conditions given the environmental setting of that particular farm. So if we look, for example, at rain-fed maize, and we can compare a country like Kenya to, say, Argentina and the USA, the potential yields, what could be grown under optimum conditions, varies from just under 8 tons per hectare in Kenya through to 9 tons per hectare in Argentina and over 12 tons per hectare in the USA. And that's purely because of the different environmental conditions. So the climatic and soil and seasonal conditions in the USA are much more conducive to maize production than in Kenya. If we move on to looking at the actual yields, what the farms really produce, then we see big differences. In Kenya, the actual yields are only 25% of the potential yield. In Argentina, about 55%, and in the USA, 80%. So you can see there that American farming systems are much more efficient and productive than Kenyan farming systems. We see similar yield gaps for most other crops in Africa, all other African crops, and across just about every African country. So the question we have to ask then is why? Why are the yield gaps in African countries so big compared to somewhere like the USA or even some South Asian countries? And it really gets down to the differences in the farming systems and the factors within those farming systems that affect yields. The first really important factor is around inputs into your crop production. This is things like seeds, the fertilizers you use to support crop growth, and pesticides and herbicides you might use to deal with pests and weeds. In many African contexts, farmers are using relatively poor seeds. They might not even be able to afford fertilizers, and they very often can't afford the pesticides and herbicides that are needed to control pests. The second is around equipment. If you look at a typical American maize farmer, he'll have 20 tractors, a combine harvester, a huge irrigation system. He or she will be very, very well equipped to really get the maximum out of their land. A typical African farmer is unlikely to have any mechanized farm equipment and actually be doing a lot of the farming through manual labor. And another really important factor is land management. So how you manage your land really affects the productivity of the land you're farming. So your soil management can affect both the soil structure and its water holding capacity, and then the amount of water that's available for plants, and it can affect the nutrient status of the soils themselves. So in the African context, again, we tend to have rather poor land management practices that aren't making use of some of the latest both technologies and understanding about how to manage the land in a way that maximizes yields. Addressing these yield gaps in Africa, therefore, is really around getting a handle on these underlying factors that produce these low yields and coming up with interventions that can overcome some of those factors.